name's Donna Marie Barnes, and I'm the curator and archivist at Sylvester Manor Educational Farm on Shelter Island. As curator there, I give tours, I tell the stories, I take care of the collection in the historic house. The Manor House was built in 1735. The property, just briefly, has descended through the same family for 12 generations since 1651. I'm not a historian. I'm a photographer, I'm a photo editor, and my background is in photojournalism and journalism. And in 2013, I should also say that I'm a lifelong summer and full-time resident of Sag Harbor, of the Sands community of Nineveh. And in 2013, I was a photo editor at People magazine. And one of the perks of working for Time Inc. at the time was the free book table. And if you were a reader, it was a great perk because you got free books, early releases, uncorrected proofs. And one day, going through the book table, I found a book that was called The Manor, 300 Years at a Slave Plantation on Long Island. And I said, what's this about? It was written by Mac Griswold, and when I looked at the dust cover, it said that Sylvester Manor was a slave plantation on Shelter Island. Now, growing up in Sag Harbor, I didn't have a great relationship with Shelter Island. I didn't know it very well. I didn't visit, you drove across it. I had never heard of this. I'd never heard of this history. I'd never heard of this place. I immediately grabbed the book and I read it and was just totally fascinated by the story of this family and this place. And that summer, I found the Manor on Shelter Island, and I arranged with some friends to go for a tour. And for those of you who have been to Sylvester Manor, you'll understand this. When you drive through the gates and go up the driveway, which is through the woods, you are met with a feeling of, where am I? What is this? And magic. And the minute that I arrived at the house and took the tour, I felt myself literally falling in love. And so the following year, in 2014, I left People magazine and moved to Sag Harbor full time and decided that one of the things I was going to do was I figured out what's next, in that what's next kind of way, was I was going to volunteer at Sylvester Manor and try to learn some more. And I became a history docent and started to give tours and became more and more involved, and eventually became a consultant and started taking care of the collection that's housed in the house and really delving into the history. And again, I was falling deeper and deeper in love and walking the grounds and taking photographs there. I felt, it sounds weird, I felt called to look deeper, to find the stories. The general history said that it was a slave plantation, and finding the names of those enslaved listed on last wills and testaments or in letters or in documents and account books, I started to wonder, who were these people? There were names listed on documents, and to give them life. So instead of just saying, in 1680, Nathaniel Sylvester, who was the original family member, he was an Englishman who grew up in Amsterdam, was a merchant, and with his brother and two partners owned two plantations on the island of Barbados, which coincidentally is where my family are from, so that was another sort of connection. And in the 17th century, growing sugar in the Caribbean and introducing it to Europe became quickly the greatest cash crop the world had ever known. Sugar was introduced to the population in Europe, and literally they lost their minds, and we can all attest we have not recovered since. And so they were making so much money growing sugar, and they were transporting African people to be the enslaved workforce. But because of the potential to make a lot of money, they were not growing food, and so they needed an alternate location to provision them. And so the term provisioning plantation was created, and they decided to buy a place in the Northeast and settled on Shelter Island, which they bought for 1,600 pounds of good Muscovado sugar. And Nathaniel, being the youngest one, was the partner who was charged with making the establishment, and with him he brought enslaved Africans to work the land. He also brought with him a 16-year-old bride who had 3 enslaved people of her own. Now, this is a phrase that I've mentioned in tours for the last 4 years. Grizzle Sylvester, his wife, was 16 years old, and she brought 3 African enslaved people of her own with her. But then I started to think, who were they, and why did she bring them? Their names were Hannah, Jacaro, and their young daughter, Hope. Now, a lot of the work that David and I are going to talk about, when you find names of enslaved people that lived here on the east end of Long Island and Shelter Island, in East Hampton and Southampton, at first it's just a name on a page. But then, to tell a story about them, you have to imagine. You have to imagine what their circumstance was, what their lives were. So just quickly, in my imagined story of Hannah, Jacaro, and Hope, who were Grizzle Sylvester's enslaved people, she brought with her to Shelter Island in 1653, when Grizzle herself was the only white woman on the island. What made Hannah attractive to her as a servant? Well, Grizzle was 16 years old. She had come from cosmopolitan London. Her father worked for the king, and so being brought by this husband to this island by herself to build a house in a settlement, she probably had absolutely no skills. And all of us who live on the East End know what winter is like now. Can you imagine what it was like in 1653, and to be a teenager by yourself? So she has a woman, Hannah. Hannah, I think most obviously, was able to speak English to communicate with her. Grizzle came, as I said, from London, from cosmopolitan highborn London. She spoke literally the king's English. So this black woman who's accompanying her must be able to communicate with her. She probably had to have some domestic skills with which to work in this house. She was a young mother. We don't know how old her daughter was, Hope, but she had been pregnant. She had gone through childbirth and nursing and to raise a young child. So she had some maternal skills to give to Grizzle. Jacaro, her husband, might also have worked in a house in Barbados because that's where they came from. And so when you do this imagining, you are giving these people 3-dimensional lives. And that expands the story. So that when I tell the story, it becomes more than Grizzle Sylvester arrived in 1653 and she brought 3 enslaved people with her, right? They become the first family of African descent of Shelter Island. And that's a distinction that we have not given these people before. And so the work that we're doing in the Plainside Project and the work I do at Sylvester Manor is to provide agency to this unknown population who were a part of this community from the very beginning, from its very founding. So I'll stop there and let David take over.
To give you an idea about what the Plainside Project does, I'll just describe how it happened, which was really in ignorance. I'm a 13th generation East Hampton with Edwards, like this was Jonathan Edwards' property of that family, and you know, it really is true that all the old families really were related to everyone else. That's just not a joke, but it actually happened. So I knew about 1 or 2 graves of enslaved people here in East Hampton. One from the 18th century, one from the 19th century. And I thought maybe there were a couple, maybe it was like Sylvester Manor, where there were, you know, maybe the gardeners had some enslaved people on the property. And I wrote a column about it in the Star. I'm the editor of the Star. I'm sorry to introduce myself as well as the place, I think. And I sort of got called out on it. I wrote that nothing further would be known about this man named Ned. And I got a message that indeed Ned is all over the town records, and you just have to crack it open and there he is. And I was chagrined because my family's always been a family of historians. My grandmother wrote the sort of East Hampton history and genealogy. Was, I thought I knew the story of East Hampton. I thought I knew the story of the Northeast, frankly, which in large measure is the story of the beginnings of America. And you flip to the back of Volume 5 of the East Hampton Town Records, and all of a sudden there's a list, or many lists. There's the births, baptisms, and deaths. And the ministers, the three of them, in sequence, in the beginning, in the late 17th century, and all the way through into the 19th century, wrote down everybody they baptized by name, and everybody who died. If you knew the name, they would write it down. And in the summer of 2017, I think it was, maybe it was, summer 2017, I had an intern. And I said, would you just do me a favor and transcribe every name out of the back of Volume 5 that appears to be a person of color? We didn't even know if they were enslaved or not. But you'd see a funny little thing, which would say, Colonel Mulford's apostrophe S, Negro Peter. We didn't know what that apostrophe S meant. And we found out. But we ended up going from 2 to 300 names, possible names, in a summer just by transcribing one book, one set of records. We called those potential enslaved people. We didn't know their status. And it turns out, so slowly through the records, we begin to figure out who they were, whether they were enslaved, free, indentured, whether they were of African heritage, whether they were Native American. There was a lot of Native American slavery in the very early days here. And now with the inclusion of a few, one census in Southampton, we're close to 500 names or known identities of people that we can say were enslaved here from the earliest, sometime around 1650, a boy on Gardiner's Island who died mysteriously, to the latest in East Hampton, a woman named Tamer, who isn't manumitted technically until 1830. That's an amazing span of time. It's a 180-year span of time, I think. So it's just astonishing period of time. So we think that we maybe have identified a third of the enslaved people that were ever here in East Hampton. And the crazy thing about all of this, and why we call it the Plainside Project, is it really was that simple. It was opening the book to page 584, and there's these names, and the list of names, and there's little pieces of story right off the bat. And then we go to lots of different sources to find other people. But just to be able to say one thing about an enslaved person on one day in 1657, to me feels radical. Not that it's even, one doesn't have to really feel mystical about it. It's just the idea that somebody got a pair of shoes on April 11th, 1740, an enslaved man named Cato in East Hampton. There we've just done it in a sense. We've perhaps put an image in your mind of this person. So now we're at the stage where we're beginning to push the Plainside Project out to other areas. We have a group in Southold that have expressed interest in beginning to look at records there. And we see it perhaps as a template that could be used in other communities, volunteers, students, whomever, to build a regional database of enslaved people through time in the Northeast, and really demonstrate how intrinsic their labor was to the economy here and the development of East Hampton and Shelter Island, and how tied in a little backwater town, supposedly, like East Hampton, was to the Atlantic, really global trade system as early as the 17th century, driven by sugar.
One of the other really important parts about it is it's as a way of giving to the public this knowledge. The understanding that this was always, this area of Long Island, the East End, these towns and villages, was always a ethnicity kind of place. There was diversity here. There were the white settlers, the English settlers, there were the Native American Montaukets, Manhansets, Shinnecocks, and there were the enslaved Africans. And moving forward into where we are now, we think that it's important that they all be included in the acknowledgement of the history. Because if we are grappling today with how do we all live together, we have to look to the past to see that we did all live together, and not under the best of circumstances. However, these people were all here, and it's time now to find them, to acknowledge them, to talk about them, to tell their stories. And so from David doing his work in East Hampton and me doing my work at Shelter Island at Sylvester Manor, we came together to sort of pool our resources because, as we said, neither one of us are historians, but we are both storytellers. And finding a name leads to more information and into a greater circumstance of just place, and the sense of place itself. Sylvester Manor, as I said, you feel these stories there. You feel it on Shelter Island and in East Hampton. And the understanding that this was happening in East Hampton, not in some far-flung farm. This was not always about agriculture. This was every merchant on Main Street. This was happening right in the town center, in the places that we all walk every day. And so...
Well, that's really one of the interesting things about this is this is kind of upending the idea of slavery, even in the Caribbean, being kind of a distant thing.
Right.
The nature of commerce here during the colonial period was such that even the smallest dirt farmer with a bushel of flax could get a piece of the action, could get a piece of the slavery economy by getting his flax over to Sag Harbor, getting it on a ship, and it flowing to the Caribbean. One of this story's been a series of epiphanies for me. One of them, which I find completely sort of striking, is that Montauk, as many of you know, was pasture land, of course. First house, second house, those were the cattle and sheep and swine keepers' houses. But what doesn't really add up is you have a relatively small communities here in East Hampton, Southampton in the early days, numbering in the hundreds of individuals. And yet you've got 3,000 head of cattle, 4,000 sheep, and some unknown number of swine out on Montauk. And you pause for a moment and you go, wait a minute, what are they doing with 3,000 or 4,000 sheep, and 2,000 cattle? Well, the answer is they're shipping it. And the likely destination for a lot of that is the West Indies. And one of the things that people, both contemporary observers in the early 17th century and historians have remarked on, is that it was much more economical to buy your food and your building material from New England than it was to grow it there. Because if it took the same amount of labor on Barbados to grow corn as it did to grow sugar, but sugar had 5 times the value of corn, it really made sense to keep your labor force working on sugar and bring in what they needed to eat, what they needed to wear, the timber, shingles, barrel staves. So New England and Long Island, English Long Island in particular, became a vast kind of storehouse and manufacturing center very, very early on for the West Indies, the English Sugar Islands, although it's a wonderful story actually, and we've both read these records. Henry Daring, right? You know, the customs house in Sag Harbor, right? H.P. Daring. Early in his career was supercargo for one of the gardeners involved in shipping horses and salt fish to Haiti during the height of sugar production and slavery. He's able to sell the herring quite quickly and spends months trying to sell the horses to the various plantation owners down there. And we know this because there's a series of probably the most whiny letters that I think I've ever uncovered in this, in history projects at the New York Public Library. And there's great details of just the uncomfortability and the bugs and the terrible food and the heat and.
But yet, he resisted the allure of the dusky brown natives, is what he wrote.
Absolutely, yeah. Meanwhile, I think he's carrying on an affair with his cousin. I mean, the whole thing is just sordid. But no, there's a lot of epiphanies in this.
Yeah.
And what is there one for you that sort of?
Well, just to connect it all, Henry Packard Deering was born at Sylvester Manor. He was the son of Thomas and Mary Deering, and his grandfather Brinley built the present-day Manor House. So as you extrapolate and find these bigger circles and how it's connected through the economy, it all connects back together. As David said, all these families have connections to one another. The Sylvesters and their descendants, the Deerings, are connected through marriage with the Gardner family. So Henry Packard Deering going to Haiti is in partnership with his brother-in-law, Nathaniel Gardner. And so one story sort of leads to another, but the bottom line is that everybody is making money. And the root of that money, in some ways, is connected to the enslavement of people.
Yeah, there's no question that the enslaved labor is kind of the engine that drives the development of these towns and the development of the colonies that eventually become states. And so it's not really a radical notion in terms of historians, but that you cannot separate the contribution of enslaved people from the development of the United States, because they were a key component in the success of these communities from really the very, very earliest days. And I realized, I noticed we're talking with two things. One, I don't want to give the impression that it was just the Gardners and the Sylvesters, because basically out here in East Hampton anyway, anybody who has a street named after him was an enslaver. I'm not kidding. Hunting, Buell, and so on. So Reverend Buell, I have my little cheat sheet here. David Mulford sold a woman named Gree, Gree, in 1796 to the Reverend Samuel Buell. The clergy had enslaved people on their property, as well as took advantage of the labor. There's a wonderful account of Nathaniel Hunting. Hunting was an interesting guy. He was the second minister in East Hampton, and protege, I think, of Davenport in Connecticut. But he comes down here, and he's a great diarist, and he keeps a record that he calls kindnesses done to me by the people of East Hampton. And he's the minister, so people would do stuff for him. And one of the things people would do for him was help him grow crops. And so on such and such a date in, I think it's May or June of 1702, he notes the help of an enslaved man, that another Mulford's enslaved man helped hoe the corn. Which is just a kind of a mind-blowing thing. One of the things I think that's important to talk about is how come we can know so much about these people, these individuals. And there's two things. One is their property, so they're going to show up in wills, household inventories for tax purposes or for probate. But the other thing is there was no cash around, really, in those days. And so we have tons of account books that have been saved, Shelter Island and East Hampton, and transactions were recorded in this double book accounting system And basically, if I did something for Donna Marie, we would both write it down, and eventually I would say Donna Marie would have to make good on that debt, either by working for me or bringing me food or something like that. So consequently, you have records of the labor on specific days of people of color, enslaved and not, of Native Americans indentured and not, in some cases enslaved early on, which is remarkable. In many ways, I think we probably will know more ultimately about the enslaved people than the white underclass here, because of that they had value. But the other thing, I sort of meandering a little bit, but I didn't want to give the impression, as I said, that this was just the Gardners.
Right.
And the other thing I don't want to do is talk about white people too much. And, because this is about the names and it is about individuals. And so for me, the first, in East Hampton, for me, the first person we know about is a woman by name of Boose, Boose, in 1657. And Boose was enslaved in the Gardner family to my great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-grandmother, Mary Gardner. But that's not why she's important. Boose, I imagine some of you heard of the Goody Garlic witchcraft trial. East Hampton had a witchcraft trial and then ended in an acquittal, which is sort of amazing. But Boose is sent across the street by Mary Gardner to tend Elizabeth, I think it's Loper. Now I'm drawing a blank on her last name.
Okay.
Elizabeth Loper, who is a young mother who's just given birth, and this will be Elizabeth's last night on Earth, and Boose is in the room when they hear scratching at the window and the sound of rocks falling down the chimney. And we know this because during the witchcraft trial, Boose gave testimony. And you can imagine this woman in this house as this 16-year-old young mother is screaming out that she sees a demon at the foot of the bed, and then testifying about it later in an inquisition in East Hampton. It's kind of wild to be able, as I said, to be able to say something about an individual by name and know how she spent a specific night in 1657.
The other thing is that when David mentioned this witch trial, several of you nodded your head that you had heard this story.
Mm.
But had you heard that there was an enslaved woman named Boose in the room who had given testimony? No. So there are stories that we all know, but there were other people present, and that's part of the work that we're doing, is to put them in the room. That line from Hamilton, in the room where it happened. Well, these people were in the room when it happened, and part of what we're doing is to put names to them.
1657 was an interesting year too. That's the year of an arson plot in Southampton, where an outbuilding and part of the main house of one of the Howell family was torched. And initially the suspects were Shinnecock men, and later on it was alleged, and I don't really know whether to believe it or not, but certainly the authorities in Plymouth took it fairly seriously, that the plot was actually led by an enslaved woman who somehow or other got enough money to pay Aguabag, I believe was his name, 6 shillings and a rifle to torch the Howell house. And that's an interesting story because it brings together English colonists very, very early on, and 16 years really into the Southampton colony. You have laborers, Shinnecock laborers, and you have this alleged ringleader who is an enslaved woman. But it gets crazier still. So after the plot the house is put out, and there's not a lot of damage. I think the repairs cost something like 20 shillings or something. It was, even in those days, not a lot of money. A guy named Mason is sent down by the Connecticut authorities to sort of sort things out, and he tells the Shinnecocks that they're going to be fined $700, and if they can't pay, we're going to take some number of your men essentially, of value, 700 pounds, and sell them into slavery in the West Indies, which essentially is a death sentence. But it's a kind of an amazing story because it ties together sugar, West Indies, an enslaved woman here, Native American labor there, an act of resistance very early on. You know, there's a great interest in academia about looking for resistance among the enslaved. Now, you don't hear about it much, and that's not the type of thing that's going to show up in one of these account books. But this is a rare instance where we have evidence, hearsay, that there was a plot led by an African American woman. In an astonishing span of time ago. I mean, 1657 for an American is a very, very long time ago.
Yes. So on that subject of resistance, again, that's something that we can't discern from a name on a list. But it is something that we can imagine, given maybe some of the circumstances, that we have been able to ascribe to some of the stories that we tell. So this woman leading a plot in Southampton is one. On Shelter Island at Sylvester Manor, a story that I tell concerns a pot that was found during the archaeological dig that we had there that was done by the University of Massachusetts at Boston in the early 2000s. And one of the most significant finds of this dig was a ceramic pot found almost intact, and the wonder of the pot when they took it back to Boston and analyzed it was that the design on it was very typical Native American of the period. But when they tested the clay which it was made out of, they discovered that it was fired in a technique that was only used in West Africa. That Native Americans in the East End or in the Algonquin nations did not fire their pots in this way. And it also had on it a handle, which was found with the pot. It was broken off, but it was there. Native American pottery and African ceramics did not have handles. That was a European device. And so this pot has become the symbol of the tricultures at Sylvester Manor. It was made by an indigenous Manhasset woman, aided by an enslaved African woman, both in the service of an English woman. And the pot, as I said, was found in the ground, practically intact. And so for me, last summer we had it returned from Boston to be on display in an exhibition. And I went to Boston to see it and to have it photographed. And my immediate thought was, how did it come to be in the ground in this way? Broken. Not in pieces, but almost just the handle broken off and a piece on the bottom. How did that happen? And again, in a storytelling imagining, I imagined that this is a pot that was used in service. It carried something, seeds, water, fruit, something that a woman had to carry in the service of her work, whether she was an enslaved African woman or if she was an indigenous Manhasset woman. She was working in service to this house and to this family, and she had to carry this pot back and forth. And one day, perhaps this pot just got, I cannot take another step with this pot. I have had it. I have had it being told what to do. I've had it just up to here. It is hot. It's August, like it is today. I've had it. And in her anger, she dropped it, because that was the only form of resistance open to her, to express how she was feeling. I dropped the pot and let it be swallowed in the mud, to be found 300 years later, for us to uncover and have evidence of these three women who came together in this place, and so that I can tell you the story about it. I don't know if this is true. I like the story a lot. I don't have a name for the woman, but it seems very plausible to me. If not with this pot, then with something else. Some way that you had to express that inner turmoil that you had to keep deep inside of you, but at the same time that allowed you to exist in this environment and in this circumstance. So that's what we mean about resistance.
There's a really fascinating sort of chain we're working on now of following the life of a man named Mingo. And Mingo's fascinating because the first time he shows up, as far as I'm concerned, was in 1785. He's here in Easthampton, and the Easthampton Town trustees vote unanimously to pay Isaac Isaacs, who's fascinating too, because he's the son of a Jew who converted to Christianity. He was kind of a celebrated grandson, I'm sorry. Anyway, so Isaac Isaacs is going to be paid to return Mingo to his owner in Southold. And the owner's name is put down as Phineas Fanning. Well, it turns out not to be Pincus. We sort that out a little later on. But then we back up to 1774 in Southold, and a Mingo is to be sold per Constant Booth's will. And he's described as a boy, because maybe he's about 10. So in 1785, he could have been 25, right? So that's not, so that's kind of interesting enough. So, okay, so there's a Southold guy. But what's crazy, and Donna Marie knows this, because I'm just at some point, we're talking on the phone in the last month, and I'm mouthing off about Mingo, it's so fascinating, blah, blah, blah. And maybe half an hour later, I get a text, oh my, blah, 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 blah. She discovered Mingo Fanning as a free man in Southampton in 1790 in the town census. So odds are this is the same Mingo. Mingo, there are, there's a lot of Catos, and the names that enslaved people were called by, I can't even really say given. Mingo is present, but it's not like Cato. There's a lot of Catos, there's a lot of Hopes. Mingo's a rare enough name that it seems reasonable to assume that this runaway, who we assume is eventually returned, is ultimately free 5 years later. And that's a very interesting one, because it's both resistance and shows the relationship between Southold and Easthampton, which is a big deal. I mean,
exactly. And Shelter Island.
Yeah.
So just in this story alone, and just to sort of explain to you how this works between the two of us, we talk often, we talk a lot, we tell each other stories and things we've discovered. So David says, I found this name Mingo. He's owned by someone who it looks like his name is Phineas Fanning, and I say, no, it's Phineas Fanning. And then when I looked him up, so Phineas Fanning was he was actually a loyalist during the Revolution, who somehow talked his way out of being the scourge of the community. And he rented and farmed Sylvester Manor for a time. And so Mingo was probably a man who was owned by him. There was another man, also another enslaved man, named Comus, who in 1795 is also given his freedom by Phineas Fanning. Comus then moves to Shelter Island, or he's already living on Shelter Island, and he buys 23 prime acres of land. He saves enough money by doing whatever kind of small jobs. He saves enough money to buy 23 acres of land from Sylvester Deering, who was the proprietor of Sylvester Manor at the time. That land was what is now called Deering Harbor Village. Mingo and Comus were owned by the same person. And so when David's telling me this story and he's excited and I get excited and I make this connection, and I went on Ancestry.com, which is a good way to sort of find things, and I put in Mingo Fanning, and then he showed up in the census in Southampton. Those kind of revelations, one, they add to the story, but it's terribly exciting to make these connections, to have these lives come alive for you, to find another step in the story, to expand the story another beyond that wall, because then you take them down the chain of time.
The moment of discovery is really quite something. I have an intern now. I think he's going to go into his junior year at Easthampton High School, And on his first day, I'm sort of over at the East Hampton Library, and I'm flipping through, I think it's document book 1, you know, it's from 17th century, and I was just like, yeah, flip, this is the kind of thing we read. And he goes, is that one? And he puts his finger on the thing covering the page, and it's words Horace, Horres. And I nearly keel over, because at this point, we think we've sort of found everybody we're going to find in the East Hampton records, and Horace is not only a new enslaved person, but he's a branch of the Dayton family that we did not know until that moment had been enslavers. And it's this moment, and I don't think John, probably to this day, doesn't quite get how exciting that was, but those little moments where you discover one. Here's another one, Japhet, which is a relatively uncommon name, Japhet. So you remember Boos, who's at the Elizabeth Loper's bedside as she's dying. Well, Boos turns up next in 1661 in Mary Gardner's will. And she's leaving Boos, Japhet, and Increase to her son David. And for a long time...
Increase means their child.
Well, that's what I was going to say. Thank you. That's my punchline. She stole my punchline.
Sorry,
no, but for about a year, I thought,
we
well,
didn't rehearse that part.
Increase, you know, what an odd name for a person, but it doesn't. It really means any offspring. So anyway, so Japhet is clearly enslaved in the status of slavery in 1661. But then my daughter, Evie, my middle child, is flipping around. I think in this case, she's doing an online search of a digitized version of the town records. And in 1674, here's a Japhet making his mark on a whaling contract, ostensibly as a free man, because he's just down as Japhet his mark. He's not like Colonel Mulford's man Japhet. So, you know, again, I keel over, because it's, you know, from the mouths of babes. I mean, the excitement when you find a person, but then when you can make a connection, there's a Japhet somehow or other over in Sylvester Manor as well. One more connection. This one is really tenuous, but it's so good I have to share. So in about the middle of the 17th century, a guy in Connecticut starts posting runaway notices for a man named John, and he describes him as extreme squint. I have no idea what that means. Tall, well-made, and he speaks excellent English and Dutch. And he was last seen headed to Rhode Island, where he might be taking up with the pirates. So that's a good enough story as it is, right? Pretty exciting. And he never finds the guy, and there's letters and so on. Well, I'm reading a book called Gardeners of Gardener's Island, and there's, you know, it's not really history, it's you know, it's sort of a series of anecdotes. And there's a reference to a guy by the name of Old Privateer Jack, who had died, and he's about 100 years old, and could speak Spanish and Dutch, and remembered when the Dutch were in New York, which makes him contemporaneous with the guy who ran away from Connecticut. And I really want to believe that Old Privateer Jack is the John who, as a young, extreme squint man, ran away and joined the pirates. I'll probably never know, but you know, that's the one. That's my sort of holy grail to decode that. Again, it's resistance, it's geography, you know, it's all these things tied together. It's quite remarkable.
You think we should take some questions?
Yeah, but I have one more thing I want to say about that's important to me, which is how we've been sold such a bill of goods about history, both American history sort of writ large, but also writ small. So I think where it really hit me is, you know, there's a story about the 1715 church, which is the first real church in East Hampton. They'd been meeting, I think, initially in the tavern, and then they built a little log cabin. And by 1715, it's about 65 years old, and it's falling down. So the town fathers get together and they decide they're going to build a new one. And they commission a building. It's the 1717 church, directly across the street from where the East Hampton Star is today. And they commissioned a building that is the largest and most expensive church on Long Island at the time, 1715. And I'd read that a million times. So that day, I thought, well, what the heck? What are these hardscrabble farmer fishermen guys just eking out a living here on the edge of the world building this wooden cathedral? It didn't make any sense. Well, what's going on clearly is there's a lot of wealth. And once you start looking at the logbooks, you begin to see where it's coming from. And it's not coming from Wales. Sorry, Grandpa, great-grandpa. It's not coming from fishing. You barely see fish in the account books. No one's paying debt here. No one is paying debts in fish. You would think they were, but no, it just doesn't show up. But rather, East Hampton, Southampton, Shelter Island were all part of a extremely lucrative Atlantic world system. We were taught, we're a generation, I think, that was taught the triangle trade in school, and maybe they've gotten away from that a little bit now. It is so much more complex than a triangle, but one point in this sort of infinite star of lines is the East End of Long Island in southern New England. And that's why they could build the fanciest church, is because they were rich men off the backs of enslaved people here and in the Caribbean.
Yes.
That was a heavy moment for me.
Yes. Yes. But tell the story about the girl in the snow.
But that can't be true. Okay, you guys want to hear a made-up story? I'm convinced it's made up. So
This is how we do. Tell the story.
yeah. So 1715, the guys are getting together. I think it's November, and there's an early snow. This is the group getting together to talk about building a new church. And one of the important men of the town is not there. They don't say who it is, but they send out a servant girl, euphemism. But they did say that, actually. They wrote servant a lot when they meant slave. They send her out to go get him. She never comes back. He never comes. And they find her dead in a snowbank and decide that's where God wants the church to be. And they build it right there. I don't believe it. It's too good to be true. However, if you search old stories, you think that that's kind of like such a good story that you got to be used, in Albany or wherever, or Georgia. It doesn't show up. It's unique. I still don't believe it. But there's a degree of plausibility in that. And if nothing else, it does place an enslaved girl there doing a task, being sent out into the snow, as a story that at least was believable in its time, whether or not it actually happened. But that's really it. I mean, really, anywhere you look, every stone, metaphorically, you flip over, there's a story about an enslaved person in this community. And I think we're really just at the beginning of the process.
Absolutely.
There's 300 names, 500 names. I think with enough effort, we could hit 1,000 names, within a couple of months, drawing in Southampton and or Sag Harbor, which gets going around 1740. Yeah.
So, we've talked a lot. Does anybody have any questions? Because we can keep talking. Yes.
That would be 100 years forward, but I was always wondering if the ships were not used also in slave trade.
Well, from what I don't know about really early years, but during the years that whaling was a major driver of the economy in Sag Harbor, during the early 19th century. So slavery ends in New York officially in 1827. It's a date that I'm sure none of you were taught in your schools, but that was the date of emancipation in New York, 1827. Many of the African descended men who were formerly enslaved went to Sag Harbor and went to sea on whaling ships as free men. So for a lot of them, this was their first encounter with freedom. And as you know, on a whaling ship, the hierarchy is based on your worth on the ship. And so many times, black men who became whalers became harpooners who were in fact the most important person on the ship because they're harpooning the whales, which are bringing in all of the money that's going to be split for all of the crew. So they were put in a position, perhaps for the first time in their lives, of leadership, of respect. And when they came back to shore in Sag Harbor, that's how a lot of free people of color worked and lived in and bought property in the Eastville section of Sag Harbor.
Okay.
Connection between the villages of Southampton and Easthampton and the colonial government in Connecticut and New England.
Southampton was first, although Southhold claims to be the same year, about 1640. And there were essentially groups of farmers, pastoralists, who were sent down to establish a colony, largely from Lynn, Massachusetts. Edward Howell ran a watermill in Lynn for 2 years, which he had purchased from someone else. And then he pulls up stakes and ends up in Southampton and sets up a, well, we all know Mill Pond. The reason it's called Mill Pond is because that's where Edward Howell had a mill. Actually, a fascinating thing about that, just jumping around a little bit, there was a free black man living there in 1659, and he was on property that the town trustees of Southampton wanted badly enough that they made him a sweet deal to move off of Mill Neck, and they gave him some acreage over on the east side of Mecox, which is now, you know, you can imagine multi-million-dollar stuff. But New York, the towns out here do not become part of the New York colony. I think it's 86 or 1686, something like that. And they didn't want to be. They wanted to be tied to Connecticut. And you know, I think there was family ties. Certainly the religious leaders were all trained, whether it was Harvard or wherever. So very, very strong ties. And it had a lot to do with geography. I mean, the Southampton settlement was the westernmost. It essentially butted up against the Dutch in the early days. And in fact, before they landed at Conscience Point, they landed somewhere else, and the Dutch scootled, you know, out and said, "You can't come here. This is our space." So we've always been out here, sort of part of Connecticut. And I think, you know, the 20th century manifestation of that was that everybody out here was a Red Sox fan.
Yeah.
After 1827, but you mentioned some of the free black people went to become whalers. Did any stay in Easthampton?
Well, I think actually part of the answer to that question is we don't know yet. This is an ever-evolving history, and we haven't quite gotten to 1827 in Easthampton, sort of.
There are, however, black gardeners, like of Gardener's Island, and a woman named Dinah Buell, Reverend Samuel Buell, in that period of time living in town here. They show up on censuses. And so the answer is, at least initially, there are people who who obtain land. Ned, who is one of the two gravestones I talked about at the beginning, the theory is Ned is buried where he lived, which is a whole other, there's a very interesting sort of backstory to that Ned was thought to be buried alone on his own property. But the evidence actually suggests that Ned wasn't buried alone. He just happened to be the only person who had an actual headstone. And as late as the 1930s, mounds, 19 or 20 mounds could be seen. And this is right off 3 Mile Harbor Road. You can visit Ned's grave today, which has been placed in its approximate location. But odds are Ned was not alone, and that he was buried with members of a free black community. There was a Lucy Gardner. I can't remember all the names off the top of my head. There's Mulford, there's Black Mulfords, so these white last names are being recycled in a sense and moving into the Black community. And you see it in the censuses are not a thing, by the way. I did want to talk about this earlier. You'd think that censuses would sort of be the be-all, end-all. What censuses can do, though, is confirm someone being in a place at a particular time whom you found somewhere else,
Yes.
in a will or in a account book or something like that. And they can also confirm status, because you don't get a name in a census until you're free.
Exactly. So, can I tell the story of Matilda?
Yeah, it's a good one.
So, in that segue into what you're saying, during the Revolution, patriotic families on the East End were forced into exile because the British were occupying Long Island. So on Shelter Island, the Deering family, who were the descendants, the Sylvester descendants, moved to Middletown, Connecticut. Thomas Deering and his wife, Mary. Mary was the descendant, Mary Sylvester. They left behind, and this is from anecdotal letters, they left behind several of their enslaved people to guard the house. And they buried their jewelry and their silver in the basement. We have not found it yet. When they returned, two of the enslaved people that I'm assuming that they had left, Matilda and London, were manumitted in 1795. Now, Matilda, her manumission papers are actually in the East Hampton Library, is where I found them. I don't know why they're in East Hampton and not Shelter Island, but regardless, I was happy to find them. And then Matilda, who might have been at this point in her 50s, borrowed some money from the Deering family so she can build a house on Deering land, which is part of the Sylvester Manor property now, that she has to pay rent on. So they've freed her, but now they've lent her money that they expect to be paid back with interest, and renting her land to build the house that she borrowed the money for, and charging her rent. Regardless, she does appear on the 1810 census as a single name, Matilda, Negro, head of household. And that statement, just that, despite the circumstances of owing the money and renting the land and building the house, is all that really matters to me. Because here's Matilda, who I can assume was probably born in about 1750, now in 1810, is living in her own home, and she is listed as the head of household on an official record. She also buys a pew in the Presbyterian Church. And so for me, Matilda is one of those names and one of those women who becomes the hero of the story. Now, I don't know whether she had children yet. I have not found any records to indicate that, or a husband. But here is a single free woman of color in 1810, living in her own home, rented, and on borrowed land in Shelter Island.
But I think part of the answer to the question, too, about where did people go, which may be the most difficult one of all for us at this point, is there wasn't really any available land. Everything was parceled up very early on into big chunks to the original English colonists, the ones with money, and then they would divide it up with their sons and sell it among themselves. So there was nowhere to go, essentially. Now, Eastville in Sag Harbor, that area, is fascinating because the way I understand it is that the initial Payne or Parsons, I forget what, who owned the land up there, was actually willing to sell to black people. And that's how that began to become an enclave very, very early on in the 18th century.
So to further that answer, Georgette Greer-Key is here, who's the executive director of Eastville. Do you want to answer that part of the question, Georgette? Georgette wants to just be a guest.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, any other questions?
village. You know anything about it?
Just that they are investigating the possibility of where the boundaries of this burying ground are and trying to figure out who, in fact, might be buried there.
Oh, apropos that, the ground penetrating radar story from Sylvester Manor is kind of mind blowing.
So we have a burying ground at Sylvester Manor. And again, when the archaeologists came to do the dig, they did do ground penetrating radar there at the burying ground, and discovered that there are up to 200 people buried there. There aren't any headstones. There are large field stones scattered within the space, and there are mounds that you can discern as probable graves. The the family, the owner's family, in the 19th century, it was the Horsford family, placed a stone in front of the burying ground in 1884. And on the stone it's etched, "The burying ground of the colored people of Sylvester Manor since 1651. This area of the property we observe as being a sacred ground. I do a lot of thinking there. In 2018, I curated an exhibition at the Manor that was called The Women of the Manor. And because my background is in photography and the arts, and Sylvester Manor has an extensive photography collection, I was able to put together an exhibit of portraits, photographic portraits of the majority of the women who descended from the Sylvester family. But I had no images for the enslaved women. I only had their names. And I walked to the burying ground and I was trying to figure out just how am I going to do this? How am I going to portray them and include them in this exhibition? Because it's important to me and to all of us at the Manor that we tell the story of all the people in everything that we do. And walking in the burying ground, I kept saying, I only have their names. I only have their names. And I finally decided I have their names. And so we had the names written. We asked the calligrapher to write them out, and we placed them on the back stairs, on the staircase that's known as the slave staircase, that leads from what is now the dining room to the first floor bedrooms, and then above to the attic, which is where the enslaved and indentured people of Sylvester Manor in the 1735 Manor House lived. And so we've left it there as a permanent tribute to the women, the enslaved women of Sylvester Manor.
Talking about the burial ground at Sylvester Manor reminds me of Peggy. There's a headstone, a little tiny sandstone headstone in the South End burial ground that you can go visit, which is by Town Pond in Easthampton. Look for a kind of lone cedar tree, and at the bottom, kind of off by itself, you'll find Peggy's grave. Kind of off by itself, but it's in line with a row of other gravestones going down that way. But to the sort of south and west, there's this big sort of lawn that is open. There's nothing there, all the way down to the fence by the pond. And I was sitting out there one day, I think it was last summer, and I was looking at the line of stones, and Peggy's is lined up, and it hits me, again, like Ned, that she's not alone. Peggy's just the only one with a headstone. And this big open area could well be where all the other free black and enslaved black people are buried. Mm-hmm. Right across, basically if you're having cocktails at the Maidstone, it's right there. It's
Right.
close. It's close to the
You've looked at it.
Yeah.
You've passed it.
Yeah.
But you just didn't
Thousands
know.
of people in there.
So now we hope that you never forget that they're there.
Well, that's right. Peggy's not alone, and we're not alone in a sense. Their ghosts are around us, really.
I'd be curious if you were able to trace any of the descendants of the original African community, either free
Right.
blacks or enslaved.
At this point, we have not found any. It is an open question. It is sort of the Holy Grail. And I think as we gather more information, because this is obviously ongoing research and discoveries, that one day we will find descendants.
A reunion.
Well,
I like to think of it as if we're providing the earliest American references to these people, either by name or simply by their existence, the date of death without a name. There's a lot of people working backwards from the 20th century. Not that many people working forwards in the same sort of grassroots way we are. And I think we will meet. There are names that are unique enough, Luce Gardner, Dinah Buell, that we're beginning to put them out on, certainly we have our own website where we're posting the names, beginning to slip them into FamilySearch.org and places like that. Rather than expect people to come to our dinky little website, we think if we can begin to get these references well-sourced out to where people are doing genealogy, someone's going to stumble on it from Oregon, and he's going to go, my God, my grandmother's name was Luce Gardner Smith, or whatever, and
Make the connection.
it's coming. It's coming. It's coming. Because if we have 1,000 names, Donna Marie, we're going to,
Somebody
that's.
had to have somebody who's...
Well, there's 105 people on the Mayflower, and Mayflower descendants, I think number in the 50,000s or something like that. So through the spans of time, even a small group can reach a lot of people, and hopefully there will be families with odd enough last names that they can begin. And frankly, the East Hampton last names and Shelter Island are pretty weird. Mulford and Dayton, and even Gardner spelled that way is peculiar. Loper is a name that sort of died out. So, by the way, I wanted to bring this up, that a Loper, our second named enslaved person in East Hampton, is Hope, another Hope. And she's a Native American girl, as she's described, and she's enslaved, I think, to James Loper, and came from Connecticut, which makes me think she was probably, as a young girl, captured as spoils of the Pequot War, or attacks on the Narragansett, which is very common that's how Native people in particular were brought into slavery, and of course would not be kept close to their home communities because of the ease with which they might escape. And sent over to Long Island, perhaps there's a better chance that James Loper could get a lifetime worth of work, or worse, out of Hope.
So all in all, this is the work that we do. This is the work that we feel we've been called to do.
Mm-hmm.
And it's the work that we have fallen in love with doing. And the stories that we're gathering and imagining and retelling will continue to grow, we hope, and we'll get excited about new discoveries and new connections.
Mm-hmm.
And I hope all of you will be interested in hearing the stories, and check out the Plainside Project website and sylvestermanor.org, and come and visit and ask questions. Thank you.
Yeah.